in kind of symposium style. It's not just a question and answer, but that's the opportunity as well for discussion within the audience about sort of the big picture in terms of the state and trends of grasslands and some of the issues that were raised and how what we need to do to address them, what are some of the opportunities and so forth. So we have some questions from the audience then that I'd like to pose to our speakers.
I just wondered if you'd be willing to comment on the ability of individual researchers or agencies to estimate how much of the existing rangeland we have left might be broken under different kinds of crop prices and different sorts of policies. I think everybody is afraid of that, but at the same time I haven't seen much of an analysis of it. Do you think it's possible to do that?
Okay, being that a lot of you people are interested in mapping, I give you another challenge then. I like giving people challenges because this was the bind we were in trying to figure stuff out. There's a lot of land, because of topography, you can't run a plow through, okay? So that'll stay in range. There's a lot of land in between, what we call fragmentation. And I know in Alberta, and I'm assuming in Saskatchewan lands grants, but you'll have to help me on that one, is their biggest challenge there is being able to trade land, okay? To manage rangeland, you want to have it in a big area, not interdispersed with little fields. And so they're in the process of trying to trade this piece of land for that piece of land so that they could cultivate that and make that work, but be able to save this other area over here. A lot of the land also is sort of rain dependent. In the past, it's rangeland because it never rained. But if we see climate change coming, and say 30 or 50 years from now, will the climate change that land so it could be cultivated? The challenge to the geographers here is to get that in some kind of a map or a database so that you know the topography, you know the slope, you know if there's stones on it, that you can't run a plow on it, and you know the soil quality. And I think we can put all that together. The unfortunate thing is that when we were trying to do it for Canada, we could find some stuff in Alberta, we could find some stuff in Saskatchewan, we couldn't put it all together. So you're right, we don't really know how much of that land can be changed. Our bigger concern is in the more moist areas, the pastures going out there, those lands being turned into canola and high-priced grain crops, leaving less grazing land, more animal density, shoving those animals down to the south, overgrazing there. That's the big concern.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with Dwayne. I think it would be possible to do that analysis. I haven't seen anybody do it, but yeah, put together the topography and the soils information and figure out how much of the rangeland could be arable. I mean, a lot of what's left in native will never be cultivated. Whether it's because of dunes or steep slopes or stoniness or salinity or whatever. But there is some native which could be cultivated, and I think about the Great Sandhills. You got the central dune area that'll never be cultivated, but there's a lot of sort of flat, coarse textured soil around it, which actually was cultivated, in the 20s, and so I think there's, and of course a lot of that's crested wheatgrass now, but I'm sure there's some that could be cultivated, and how much? I think that's a research project. Yep.
And I just wanted to say one thing about never cultivated. There's a place I hunt in. I can see some hills from where I hunt, and I drove over there to look for mule deer one time. I thought, well, this is going to be native grassland, right? Because it's too steep and too rocky to cultivate.
But don't call it crackling.
No, I won't. But it had all been broken,
Yeah.
and it was not growing grass. It was growing weeds and sweet clover over about at least 25 square kilometers. And they'd just gone from the top from the bottom to the top, and some policy drove it, maybe quota, I don't know what it was. But, I mean, that kind of, I think that somehow should be in the equation, the policy piece.
Just an example from the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. In an area where there's about 2 million acres of native prairie in the southeastern corner of Alberta.
In the southeast corner of Alberta, where we often will have irrigation juxtaposed against rangeland, we had to make kind of a rough estimate of what we thought might be vulnerable in the next, say, 50 years. And in terms of probably the most vulnerable lands are the lands that are suitable that are near irrigation and have moderately coarse textured soil suitable for potato production. And we had estimated something on the order of 150 to 200,000 acres potentially that could be kind of in that category. But an interesting thing that's happened in Alberta for any of you that followed the potato farm story. It's kind of our Jekyll and Hyde personality that we have often in our province. But there was kind of an awakening, public awakening about this land that was actually, if you look at if you go online and you look at the advice to cabinet for the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan, you'll see, and it's on my map out here in the poster session. There's a conservation network that's recommended by the Advisory Committee for Southern Alberta. These are the real core lands, public lands that need to be maintained long term. And interestingly, if you know where the potato farm was to be, it's kind of in the heart of all that. So you know that when you're sitting in church on Sunday and people turn to you and say, before they shake your hand, they say, "Are you involved in that potato business?" You know that there's been kind of a social awakening about the issue. So you know, we went through 2 cycles, and there is a growing public interest in prairie conservation to the extent that the pressure overturned that project. So I'm a little bit optimistic.
I think in Manitoba, didn't you lose some native prairie to potato, like sandy soils that were irrigable, got lost to potato cultivation there too, so same situation, yeah.
How do you think about drainage channel change or drainage system change in prairie, and how will it affect the prairie?
The drilling?
Drainage.
Oh, drainage. Well, you were talking about the
Yeah,
wetland.
are you talking about artificial drainage?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, well, sorry. Yeah, I mean, it's a big issue with loss of wetlands, is artificial drainage of wetlands, and there are parts of the prairies where it's a huge thing. There are lots and lots of wetlands have been reduced by drainage, and the problem is when we have these wet years like we've had the last 3 years, there's so much flooding of agricultural land that there's just increased pressure for drainage, and so yeah, obviously it's a big problem.
The question was how much land will move to crop. I've been puzzling for quite a while. When you hear over and over and over again about producers liquidating their herds, and some of them say, "Oh well, I'm going to have grassers," and then the price of grassers goes through the roof. So you kind of wonder what happens to those pieces of grassland. But if we find a way to find out the answers to those 2 questions, what are we going to do about it? And I think this fellow over here, when he mentioned policy, we've obviously struggled really hard to get through to the policymakers on this. But the addition to that thinking too is what happens when we get policy that results in regulation that's so tight that we've tied the hands of our producers. So how do we move to middle ground so our producers can continue to do a good job of conserving and producing, and manage to stay on the land, because going too far one way or the other will drive them out.
I guess the number one thing that all those 10 other people were telling me to tell you at this meeting was, like, we know how to manage the land, we got the agronomy, we've got the range management, it's the policymaker, it's the social issues that we have to handle. And what they were telling me was that the cattle industry, in other words, the Canadian cattlemen, Saskatchewan stock growers, Alberta beef producers, need to come together with this group here and present some ideas on how to manage these lands. Because the driving force has to come from the producers to make this whole thing work. The producers have to step up to the plate. The other thing is, what they're saying is, we still have to get to those policy people. We still have to get them to meet with the producers. We still have to get them to ride a horse or ride a pickup or walk across a piece of rangeland. Not for a photo op or a political photo op, but for them to learn something. And we need to have our range people out there sharing that information to them. And I think that way, with both agencies working together, then we can get things to work so that producers will still be able to make a living. Their hands won't be tied. They'll still be able to keep the grasslands going.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's the idea behind the Prairie Conservation Action Plan in Saskatchewan, which is, you know, led by the Saskatchewan stock growers, and it is a venue for producers to sit at the same table with conservation groups. So, I mean, obviously that's a real good model, and I think lots of places in the world would like to have as good a cooperation as we have here with between those two groups. I think, yeah, the bigger issue is the policymakers in both federal and provincial governments. I think that's the big issue is communicating the importance of conserving these lands to those people.
One of the big challenges that we have, I'm from Kansas, so I don't know what your policies are here in Canada, but one of the big challenges for the livestock, the cattlemen, is drought and trying to deal with having to sell off their entire herd because they have a dry year and they don't have any way to get feed for their livestock, and the cost goes way up high. And so it's worse than being in Las Vegas and trying to play the roulette wheel, because they're there one year and the next year they're wiped out. Do you in Canada have any kind of a rangeland insurance program? Like we have crop insurance, do they have rangeland insurance here? And have they thought about that idea?
In Alberta, we have actually two insurance programs for ranchers. One is based on remote sensing, and the other one is based on weather stations. And I believe the US has something similar. I think they adopted ours with some twists a few years later, but I'm going to be talking to the rangeland one, or the satellite one, on Thursday. I'm not sure if you're going to be here for that or not. But we also, actually, it's interesting you mentioned that question, the feed replacement price is going up. We also have embedded that into our insurance programs, where we offer an insurance price in the spring, in the producers sign up in February. We have a provision that says if we have a defined way of calculating it, but if the price of feed goes up in the fall by 10% or more, and you have a loss, we use the fall price to compensate you on. So if feed prices have got, replacement prices have gone up 25%, and you have a loss, it's embedded in the compensation you get. That's the easy part. There's some questions about how good, for want of a better explanation, the remote sensing program is and the weather station programs are. As I say, I'll be talking about the remote sensing program Thursday.
Can I ask a question? Just wait, I want to make one more comment. In regards to this drought and hay storage and that sort of stuff, I guess that was one of the reasons why I brought up that idea about the electric fence and the deer. Because in the south part, that's been the major problem of trying to store feed over from year to year. Okay? Wild animals getting in. The other thing, in our area, we had a drought in 2002, 2003. A round hay bale was selling for $100 a bale. Okay? So I got our extension economists to look at, okay, so in times of lots of hay, what would it cost you to put that under a shed? And how many years of drought would you have to have for the paid off the cost of that hay shed? So that's another way that people are looking at being able to have a long term, like a 5, 6, 7 year type feed supply storage type system to look at the drought problem.
I was just going to say, in the States, I was actually the principal investigator working on the development of the U.S. range insurance program from satellite remote sensing. And it wasn't the technology that prohibited us from implementing it, it was politics. And turned out that the government agency that was supposed to deal with it really didn't want it to succeed because they didn't have enough people to manage it.
Fair enough. I'd just like to ask a question. A few months ago, I sat in a workshop, and if I recall correctly, I think a large part of the discussion, or a fair amount of it, was on carbon sequestration, and it was on, I think the focus was on if converting marginal cropland to pasture land, kind of measuring the carbon sequestration benefits associated with that. Well, it kind of gets back to the other way, it's the flip side of the coin. How does that get dealt with if somebody takes rangeland and puts it into cropland? Is there, I'm not sure how it's handled or whether it's even considered now, but if you're looking at it on one side of the coin, it seems to me you should be looking at the flip side as well.
So Brian, you're the man.
Well, we have estimates of conversion of grassland to cropland, and the country records that. Obviously, it's a loss of carbon, but there's no system to put that back to any individual landowner. And they can't charge, even if there were an offset system or something. There's no mechanism for that. It's just considered what's called leakage. So, yeah, it's something that we try to account for, but it's not something that we have any plans, or there's really no political will that we can see to ever try to, if there were some kind of price on carbon, to actually charge that back to the person making the conversion.
That's a good lead into my question. My question is, how do we make sure that we value the grasslands appropriately? Thus far, we've certainly been able to put metrics around the bad that the Canadian cattle industry produces through studies like Livestock's Long Shadow. But how do we make sure that we put the metrics around the good in terms of greenhouse gases, in terms of biodiversity and water quality? And where are we on that, and where do you think we're going to go?
Okay, I'm going to ask Janice. Hi, Janice. Can you start off and make some comments in your report, or where you put the value of the Saskatchewan forage industry, how you put in the figures for the rangeland here, and then we'll ask our friend from Kansas, because he was talking to me at coffee time on some ideas that they did in the States.
So I'm going to ask Leanne to stand right beside me, because she happens to be the consultant that worked with us on that report. So here, it's a small world we travel in. Here in Saskatchewan, of course, we did an industry analysis project, and Leanne can talk to this better than me, but truly it was putting the value on those indirect values. So things like biodiversity, water conservation, I mean, you go on and on. But even just by making some assumptions, I think the most important part in that report was that we were able to put a value, and you can argue it and say, well, we don't agree, it should be 10% higher or 10% lower. But the biggest impact of that was that it's raised the awareness with policymakers, right? People are starting to understand that we need to have the conversation. And now other provinces, Alberta's just finished their report. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't want to say that our report was flawed, but you could argue those numbers and we'd be fine with it. But the biggest thing is that we've started the discussion and we've tagged a value to it. And I know now at the national level, the CFGA, so the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association, is working with Ag Canada, and they're doing a bit of a study to try to pull together all the work that we've done in the provinces to do exactly that, Fawn, right? Let's put a national value to some of these indirect benefits of the industry, and let's at least start the conversation.
And I guess we have to thank Janice and her group for doing it, because Alberta followed. And when Alberta announced their report, the deputy minister was there and said, gee, this is a big industry. We'll have another forage specialist hired in the province. So that's how it goes. So just, can you make your comment about what you did in?
Yeah, in our state, we're 40% grassland and 40% cropland. And U.S. Department of Agriculture assessed the value in terms of funding from those different lands. And our croplands generated $3 billion in revenue on average each year. Our grasslands produced $7.5 billion a year in revenue, more than twice what our croplands were producing. And it was mostly off of livestock and mostly cattle.
Just one more point about valuing grassland. I think Barry brought up this idea of cumulative impact assessment, and I think we need to quantify the effects of all these developments, whether it's cultivation of grassland or linear developments. This idea of cumulative impact assessment is we try to quantify the total impact of all the different developments in an area, and we'd like to relate that to biodiversity in some way, so that and I guess we'd also relate it to forage production, other values from rangeland. I think it's pretty easy to propose a development which that development on its own doesn't look very serious, but cumulatively with all the other developments in an area, it can amount to a substantial loss of grassland and grassland biodiversity and other values. So I think that whole idea of cumulative impact assessment is kind of the way of the future. So.
Hi, I'm Murray Bentham with Agriculture Canada, and Branimir here had his chance to ask this question, but he didn't ask it, so.
Branimir is my student, so I'm going to ask the question anyways. Dwayne, you were talking about grassland and the impact on our grassland due to climate change and due to crop prices, and what might the drivers be to move grassland into cropland. And I just want to pose the question or introduce bioenergy into the equation, and how you think or feel that the demand for bioenergy crops could affect our grassland and marginal lands.
I guess the big question is whether there's going to be enough rain in those areas for the crops to grow. In talking with 3 of the scientists that have sort of done that or involved in that work, I guess they're sort of questioning growing the C4s up here, maybe because of the climate, that sort of thing. I think one has to really look at, where this bioenergy is going to come from. When I was at Melford, we did all sorts of work on raising cattle on straw and utilizing straw. And then about 5-6 years ago, Iogen and Shell were going to put a straw plant in a Prince Albert and make fuel out of that. And we got wondering, okay, so there's going to be a market for straw. How's that going to affect the cattle industry, because they're not going to have access to it? And then in other studies, there's a lot of interest in using poplar trees or the lumber, not the lumber, the forest industry type of product. And we've had speakers in there, and the things that they were looking at were just going to be huge in comparison to anything else. But basically in all 3 of the things, the straw playing, the aspen string, it was the technology to make the thing work that was the limiting problem. Transportation to get the stuff to the place was the second biggest thing, and storage was going to be the third big thing. So like I just don't know on the bioenergy end of things. Right now, we're seeing a big thing in canola. My daughter-in-law's father is heavily involved in a big ethanol, not ethanol, but a biodiesel plant in Foam Lake, and they're buying up all the green and scrap canola they can. There's another great big canola biofuel plant going to go in at Lloydminster. So at this point in time, it's the canola diesel thing that's driving everything. As far as it goes from there, like in Canada, I just don't know. In Brazil, sure, it's the sugar cane. In the tropics, it's the sugar cane. It's the warm season crops, but I just don't know whether we can get them growing here in enough volume to make it work. I just don't know. But you're the modeler, you should know.
We don't know.
Like, what do you think?
We don't know how much grassland we have yet.
Well, you've come to the right place, because all the geographers and GI people and remote sensing people are here, and they're going to let us know where it is.
Exactly.
On a section by section basis. Right on. In a database that people can get access to. That was their other big thing. Like, you had some really neat graphs, or not picked maps up there. But when we put that book together, we couldn't find them for anything. So we need to get that kind of information out to the public. Don't just keep it in the journals. Journals are not read in the bathroom. If you got the stuff, put it on foragebeef.ca so people can get it.
Hi, I'm Tim Martin, and I'm here from the greenhouse gas accounting perspective of things, I think. And to me, there's an ambiguity here, and as Murray said, we don't know how much grassland we have. And I think this afternoon, I've heard the term grassland used in a way that may or may not be synonymous with everything from native rangeland or rangeland to forage production, which I think is cultivated, to swath grazing, which is definitely cultivated. So I think before we can really get to beginning to understand the question of how much grassland do we have, we need to figure out what we're talking about here in the next day in terms of grassland, or make sure we are all on the same page. I'm hearing a lot about the cattle industry too, and what I'll get out of the next day and a half is the strong relationship between the cattle industry and grasslands. But I think we're really wanting to talk about grasslands, and whether we should bring in cattle when it helps us understand the grasslands, I think. But I'm wondering if we're doing great exploration, but we're discussing 4 or 5 different things and not always being clear on what we're discussing.
So what I was looking at was basically the mixed prairie grasslands. In the past, we had native land, we had unimproved land or unimproved pastures, and we had cultivated or seeded pastures. And we were running into a problem in Canada of having the range people on this side of the fence, the native people on this side of the fence, and this all came from SRM being involved in Society for Range Management. And we had the people involved in the seeded pastures over here. On the international basis, it was the same thing. So in order to try and get those people together, we basically talked about grazing lands or grasslands. So it was all encompassing so that we weren't leaving people out. But yes, we do have rangelands within that. We've got native, and on the other side we do have cultivated pastures, and Census Canada recognizes that. Our biggest problem has been trying to get Census Canada to get rid of the word unimproved. And we have worked and worked and worked with Census Canada trying to get wording changed. But they won't do it because they've been told on high that we don't want to pester farmers for more information. So that's sort of the bind we're in. But Barry, you might have a better scenario there.
Well, we're in Alberta, might have closer here, sorry.
Ron McNeil is here as well from Alberta. We both have been involved in the grassland vegetation inventory. And what we're doing with GVI, we're about 200 townships left to go, about a year and a half. We will have mapped, classified our grasslands into 32 site types. The definition that we're looking at, based on high quality imagery, these are plant communities that look like native plant communities. Now, when you get on, some of them may be modified in terms of invasive, certain content of non-native species, but on imagery, they don't have sharp lines from cultivation or attributes of things that have a cropping history. They're things that look like native grassland. So, and how many townships, Ron, in the grassland natural region? Would be about 1,500, something like that. So we're close. So we recognize that this is the number one question we need to define. You can't manage it if you can't measure it.
Yeah, I mean, there's really, there's several different possibilities, aren't there? I mean, at the one extreme, you've got something that's obviously seeded, cultivated, and you can see the rows of seeding, and at the other end, you've got something that's 100% native, but there's a whole range of variation in between there. You know, native grassland that's been invaded by tame species. In some cases, it was cultivated for 10 years in the 20s or something like that, and you know, mostly native species came back in. You know, so there's quite a range, and a lot of, especially in the moister parts of the prairies, a lot of what gets called native prairies is has a large percentage of tame species in it just because of invasion. So I think it's only really in the dry country that we can make a good separation between truly native prairie and seeded prairie. You know, especially in the moister regions, there's just like the whole range of possibilities in between. So.
Well, I'd like to follow up on that. We hear a lot about the conversion of grassland to cropland. But I've heard, anecdotally at least, that there is some conversion of cropland back to grassland, native or tame pasture and so on. Based on the economics that we hear from across the border, it sounds like that would be a really positive move, is to convert from crops to pasture for livestock. Could we have just a few comments on that conversion back to grassland? Is it happening? How widespread is it? Are there issues? What are the driving forces and so on, if it's happening?
Okay, about 5-6 years ago, we started following the CRP program the United States have in converting of land. I'm not 100% sure that there was money involved, and some of the guys here can help me out. But in those times, yeah, we were seeing quite a few fields going back to grass, especially in Saskatchewan. But when I checked 2 weeks ago, it was my understanding in Saskatchewan there's very, very, very little forages being sown this year. Now, I could be wrong, and it could be in isolated areas. And I guess to get back on this question of the grasslands being broken up and seeded, I think one of the bigger comments coming out of the people that I talked to in Alberta was the oil and gas, recreation, windmills, coal-based methane. That was their big concern. Like, this stuff wasn't going to be plowed up. It was just that we're going to be filled with roads, pipelines, power lines, houses, that sort of thing. And Barry had a really neat slide that I wish I would have been able to use, but it shows how it all grew. And he's got, like, it goes like this in the presentation until at the last slide, the whole section of land or the whole township is colored in different colors from all of those kinds of things. So that, from the people from Alberta, that was their bigger concern, as opposed to the breaking of the land for seeding. Oh, and the one other big concern that they had there, again, on losing the rangeland, was the oil and gas companies wanting to dump their driller, not the mud, but the effluent coming out of the wells onto the land. And right now, apparently, Barry, you can correct me if I'm wrong, they can't do that, but the oil and gas industry are really lobbying the new government in Alberta so that they can dump that stuff on the land rather than trucking it out.
It's the cuttings from us.
Cuttings.
The cuttings from a special type of drilling tool. It's not drilling waste,
Yeah.
Diesel fuel and vertimites and things like that. But anyway, we have a moratorium on that.
Yeah,
Special areas like that on the land.
sorry, as far as cultivated going back to grassland, of course, I mean, most of that is going back to tame pasture, like seeded exotic species. And so there is some work going on reestablishing native prairie, but it's a pretty small part of the whole puzzle. And, even if it's successful, it's sort of a few of the species from native prairie, it's not the whole native prairie. So, while that's a great thing to see people working on, I think, we should take the attitude that when we lose native prairie, we've essentially destroyed it. We can try to mitigate that as best we can, but we should treat it as kind of like Amazon rainforest, that we've lost most of it, and every acre that we lose in the future, is a loss. So,
I want to come back to what we talked about earlier. Ron McNeil, Landwise Inc. at Lethbridge. Early in this session, we were talking about the risks that are associated with certain lands, native lands, and saying that hummocky lands aren't as prone to being broken because of that topography limitation. I beg to differ. I think we've got big issues with that because of the new types of equipment that we have. Many of the people are not experiencing the erosion like happened in the past and can grow zero-till crops quite successfully. So we have a real threat out there that there could be an increase in the land base, and I don't think we should overlook that. I also want to point out and follow up what Barry talked about earlier in the moderately coarse textured, the sandy loam soils, and our risk in Alberta for potato production. But I also see an opportunity in those kinds of lands because, for instance, a big chunk of what I drove through today in the area near Leader, Saskatchewan, has got field after field of rye production on these sandy loamy sand soils. That's what's very suitable. Let's look at the opportunities. Is that a biofuel? For example, that's a very successful annual crop, and maybe there are ways that we can have alternatives. So I really promote the kind of work that Murray is doing, and I'd like to see not only some of our annuals, but let's look at natives too. Are there certain native species that are quite have some applicability as crops? They don't have to be harvested every year, but maybe we've got some opportunities of putting natives back as more stands that are multiple species, not necessarily a monoculture, but could be harvested for biofuels.
Branimir Jetfly, my concern, what I'm working on, and hopefully work on a project, is economics of development of biofuel crops. We're not talking about canola here. We're talking about new crops that haven't been used industrially in both Saskatchewan or Alberta. Those crops are quite suitable for dry lands. They're not being used for agriculture now, and those crops are quite suitable saline soils. They're not being used for agriculture. Then if we think about the crops that can be used for cellulose and ethanol production, there could be the native prairie could be converted to growing grasses, whether it is a tame species introduced or is it a mix of native species. My concern is a long-term development in this direction and ideas about economics, because what I see happening, new crops being developed, new technologies being developed, we use it for 5 years, we use it for 10 years, and then we decide, oh, this is not what we want to do. As Jeff mentioned, once you plow up or modify the native prairie, it's almost impossible to get it back. So we all talk about economics, we all talk about what is going to happen to prairies and native prairie, but I think what we have to talk to politicians and the public, the value of native prairie as a native prairie, because once we convert it, We can do experiment, we decide 5 years later, well, there's no economics, but once we convert it, we lose it forever. So that's one of my big concerns.
I suppose this is a statement of the obvious, but you know, the key factor in new crop development and biofuel development is policy. It's not technology. It's not economics, because as the previous person said, you get going on an experiment and the government figures, hey, you know, there might be something in this. So let's just throw $20, $30 million at it, $50 million at it, and see what we can do. And then you break 100,000 acres, and then you say, well, it didn't work out. But that, I think, has to be a focus when we're in this discussion, that talking about the role of policy is essential if we're going to really communicate to decision makers that we need to tread carefully. And any assumptions about what can't be done can be modified with money. And so we have to be really cognizant of that policy piece.
Peg Strangman, consultant. I'd like to go back to Tim's point on definitions. I think it's critical that we come to some kind of an understanding of what we're talking about. I recently spent quite a bit of time looking at definitions for rangelands and grasslands, and I came across over and over and over again native pasture, native grasses, but people have used it in a variety of terms, just exactly the way Tim was talking about. And then most recently, I was reading the recovery strategy for the long-billed curlew. And if you go through that from Environment Canada, you find just a variety of different language in there that they have used to describe rangelands. So we're going to have to come to some understanding of what we're talking about here, if we're going to talk to the policymakers for sure, but also if we're going to respond to these legal issues that are going to be facing us. So just to go back and support Tim's point one more time. Oh, and the grass seed. Somebody just recently told me that sales of grass seed are up. That's secondhand information.
But that could be sales, but where's that seed going though? Yeah, sales could be up. Got to figure out where it went. Just one comment on the definition. It might help, Society for Range Management has basically a compendium of definitions. And they have sort of the master definition if you want to start there.
And they don't define native grass, native pasture, native anything.
Okay, could be. It's been a while since I've looked at it. Yeah. But talk to Barry. He knows everything.
I may be able to get up my head through the door. I think one way that I would try to respond to that question, and I think Jeff might look,
I think one way to respond to that question, what are we talking about, is we have some tools that we've been developing in Saskatchewan and Alberta, other locations, that help us to look at a grassland and characterize it, classify it, and that is one way to move forward using knowledge tools that we've developed, whether it's a native community within the hierarchical classification of a biome or a subregion. So, you know, I think there are some tools that can help us there.
Yeah, I certainly agree with all this, that it'd be good to have some clearer definitions. The only thing that worries me is as soon as we start talking about what plant species are there, the politicians, you know, if they were interested at all, they've lost interest at that point. You know, I mean, the distinction between one grass and another is not gonna, you know, catch their attention very much. I don't think it should, but it's a challenge.
But we're teaching oil companies to use plant community guides.
Yeah.
To guide their reclamation. And so if we can, you know, advance knowledge there.
And in the restoration area, like my daughter-in-law works for that out of Calgary, and they had a course at Olds College last week on that very thing. So in the restoration business, they are using that kind of information in the oil and gas restoration stuff.
If I can just add another thought, I think when we're looking for definitions of what we want to work with, in our discussion over the next day, and also in the long term, if we want to answer Murray's question of how much we have, it's really useful to have definitions that actually can be somehow measured. And so in that sense, I'm quite excited to hear more about what you're doing in Alberta, where using remote sensing Earth observation techniques, you're able to come up with 32 classes. I mean, I don't care how many classes we have, as long as we know what the classes are, then we can recombine them in the 72 different ways I've heard them talked about already this afternoon.
Hi, it's Mike Watwell from the Canadian Wildlife Service. And just thinking again with the frustrations around the defining of native grass, but then listening to what we've heard here today, especially about the future. And it kind of seems we're a little worried on the native grass side about functional shifts, where in the future we have a tame grass that's a biofuel that is a mimic of native to some degree, and we get that on the landscape. And if we don't have native well-defined that our politicians, our policymakers can understand at the get-go, the question is going to be, what's the problem? What's the problem to wildlife? And I'll use an example from wetlands. Often you see a bunch of wetlands drained, or and through the mitigation process, you end up with a drainage retention pond, right? And in the process, you lost a semi-permanent and some seasonals and some wet meadow, and this was the mitigation. Well, there's been a huge functional shift to the landscape. You now went from dabbler habitat or marsh wrens to grebes and coots, something like that, right? Stuff that's not easy to get back. And from what I'm hearing here is reclaiming back to native may be a no-go. So I think as part of our grassland discussions in policy or a path forward, we have to get people to understand what that native component is that we're worried about losing, whether it be function or a suite of species, that sort of thing.
I'm Brenda Dale. I'm from the Canadian Wildlife Service as well. And I just want to make a comment to follow up on something Jeff said about the rainforest. And many years ago, I worked with Dr. Tony Diamond, who had worked all over the world, including in the rainforest. And he made the comment that what had been done to the rainforests was a tea party compared to what had been done to the Canadian prairies. But the reason I wanted to bring that up was because one of the issues is about awareness. That's great that people will ask Barry about Potato Gate in church, and I'd be very happy if everybody was that aware of what's happening to prairies and how at risk they are. But I think a lot of Canadians would know a lot more and care a lot more about whether trees are knocked down in South America than that they will notice that the prairie is gone here. And that is going to be one of our biggest issues in moving forward, because without that will of the general public and that interest, you'll never get the political will for any of the policy or anything. Sorry, it's kind of negative, but I just wanted to follow up on that.
Well, I've made it my personal mission to convince people from Saskatoon to go to Grasslands National Park, and most people can't understand why they would go there. There's no mountains, there's no lakes, there's no forest, and I've taken quite a few people down there, and they all come back convinced. Okay, that's why it's so great, So let's get everybody from up here to go down to Grasslands Park at least once, and that'll be a step forward.
Hi, my name is Dandan Zhu, and I'm a PhD student in Department of Geography and Planning, U.S. And I have two questions about rangeland health. So I noticed that there are three categories of rangeland health condition. I noticed there is one health condition that is healthy with problem between healthy grassland and unhealthy grassland. And I want to know what are the problems. And another question is that what is the difference between the grassland management among these three grassland health conditions?
I wondered that too.
I think that's one for Barry.
Gee, Barry, we're glad you're here.
I'm serious, I was not paying attention.
Well, that's an easy question. It's a very good question. When I started my career, we had a tool for measuring the health of the grassland, and it was called range condition. And it only looked at one thing. It looked at species composition. But as science has evolved, especially through the 90s, throughout North America and other parts of the world, there was a recognition that we need to look at rangelands as being much more than just landscapes that produce forage. They also produce a bunch of other things. They store carbon, they maintain watershed function, they provide habitat for wildlife. And so range health, the concept of range health was a new language, not condition, we called it health. And it involved looking at indirect measurement of various functions. It's not that we're measuring them directly, but we're getting a bit of a reading on them. So for example, in range health assessment that we use in Saskatchewan and Alberta, we don't use the system quite like the Americans use it. It's 17 indicators. We boiled it down a little bit because we don't have a lot of the same problems that they have with soil erosion. We have a little easier pathway here in Canada with the rangelands that we deal with. So we look at 5 indicators: species composition, the mix, like what are the plants that are there? Structure, are all the plant life layers present, or are any of them reduced? Litter or mulch, that's the insulating layer on this that helps us conserve scarce moisture. Then we roll together the soil indicators all into one. We look at site stability and weeds. Okay, so those are our 5 indicators. And we tie those back to our basic principles of range management. And the key one, the key principle of range management that we're applying these indicators against is our conservation of biomass. We need to harvest forage to earn our livelihood, to produce products, but we need to leave enough residue behind. We need to allow enough rest in the system to protect plants and soil. So healthy indicates that all 5 of those factors are fairly strong, and we think all the major functions are being performed. Healthy with problems, we can think of that as being a flashing yellow light. That it doesn't mean the system is broken, but there's some warning signs that we need to pay attention to. Maybe we've had a drought, maybe we've been overstocking in the short term. We don't have enough litter, and that increases the risk in the grassland. So healthy with problems is a warning. Unhealthy tells us that a number of those indicators have gone over to the red side of the dial, and we need to really alter what we're doing to maintain health. So that's a long-winded attempt, but does that make sense? Okay, thanks.
Barry challenged me, so I have to respond. He challenged me to talk about something that's quite uncomfortable. In Alberta, there's a private members bill that's just been presented that I haven't read through it all completely, but it's making members of the cattle producer community pretty anxious. And the basic gist of it is a system of regulations to protect native grassland. But in doing that, it will obviously restrict some of the decision-making ability of the producer community. So I was sitting here thinking about policy decisions and trying to influence politicians, and Grassland doesn't vote. So if we're concerned about Grassland, why are we concerned about Grassland? Is it because we want to keep our cattle industry healthy, because we want to conserve something that we think is valuable? Are we protecting ecosystem services? Blah, blah, blah. You can go on and on and on. But if you're going to talk to the politicians about it, then you're going to have to put it back into people terms. And maybe we should just address the elephant in the room. If we're going to conserve ecosystem services and the biodiversity of the native grasslands, who pays? And at this point in time, it looks like the producer is going to pay. And that, well, society can set up any kind of rules it wants, but is that the right way to do it? Are we really serious about, as a society, about paying for ecosystem services? No, I don't think we are, because we still have too many of them. And until we get to the point where they're in short supply, then people are willing to pay. I mean, market forces come into play, right? Anyway, I'm going on and on and on. But because Barry challenged me to talk about something that was very uncomfortable, because the producer community is going to fight this bill, because it's going to restrict what they can do on their native grasses. On the Crown land, sorry, I didn't be really clear about that. And maybe the bill is the right thing, maybe not. But just for your own interest, go in and read through the bill and see what you think, and then put yourself in a producer's shoes. And so you have 3 or 4 sections of Crown lease land that's been in your family for 3 or 4 generations, and that's what you raise your cows on. And somebody's threatening that in some way. So just to try and look at both sides of the picture. Oh, sorry, Bill 202, and the legislative session is 28 or something. You have to get the right legislative session, or you get a bizarre bill that gives you an auditor general or something. That's what happened to me the first time around.
I think maybe we better thank the panel.